Yeah, thanks for that wonderful introduction. I really do think that was a great way to start the night, because I think really what we are talking about is exactly, as Carol was saying, trying to find some a new reading of Jane Jacobs. Something that it maybe has some of that perennial quality, but is sort of a counter reading of Jane Jacobs, against the grain. And that's the idea of the second Jane Jacobs century for me, is just this idea of, in 2017, what are all the pieces of other things that Jane Jacobs said that are not as well known, that might give us some new fuel for thought. So I think probably most of you guys know who Jane Jacobs is, but just to give you a little overview, she was one of the most influential urban writers of the 20th century. And this Thursday, as Carol was saying, would have been her 101st birthday. She's best known for her first book, which is The Death and Life of Great American Cities, as well as for her activism here in New York, fighting against urban renewal in Greenwich Village, roadways to Washington Square Park, and the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have gone through Soho, Little Italy, and Chinatown. So, but tonight, right, since it's the first year of the second Jane Jacobs century, we want to get past the Jane Jacobs we already know, and all of the celebrations of her legacy over the past year. Our idea of Jane Jacobs has been stuck in what she opposed rather than what she was for, and stuck in the great American cities of 1961 and not the great American cities of 2017. So tonight we want to explore Jane Jacobs as a kind of futurist, actually. Someone fascinated by science and technology, and I was always on the lookout for, again, she was incredibly prescient. In 2004, she called the housing crash of 2008. Some say she even predicted our current political climate in her final book, Dark Age Ahead. And yet, she was not much for prophecy. As she says here, life is full of surprises. Prophecy is for people too ignorant of history to be aware of that, or for charlatans. So it's fascinating to me that someone so prescient could be so dismissive of the idea of prophecy, of looking into the future with any kind of certainty. But really, I think the key is that she looked at the present with a clarity that most of us could never, ever hope to achieve. So tonight, Sandy and I are going to play the role of charlatan, and we're going to try and peer into the future that Jane Jacobs was sort of excavating in the present, and try and see where she was going, particularly throughout her career and then at the end of her life. So Sandy is going to talk a little bit about her unfinished book that she was writing when she died in 2006. And in that book, she would have kind of looked at human history in the grandest scale you could possibly imagine, from the earliest human settlements all the way to our sort of uncertain future. And that has a lot to do with her economics work and her work on work, the idea of work. And then after that, I'm going to return actually to some ideas that Jacobs explored in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and looked at how those big ideas kind of evolved over her career, and where they might take us in the future. So, Sandy?
Excellent. All right, so building a little bit off of what Carol said, I feel like these days when we think of Jane Jacobs, the Jane Jacobs we know, right, the patron saint of Hudson Street, is in some ways trapped in amber now. Those who revere her tend to think of her as essentially timeless, as Carol said, right? An evergreen, font of wisdom about city life. Meanwhile, those who have sort of soured on her try to relegate her to the past. They say that her thinking comes from another time and place altogether. A relic of Greenwich Village in the 1950s and 60s, a toolkit of small-scale ideas rendered more or less useless in a time of huge-scale urban and global problems. Either way, I think she remains sort of caught, held in the long-since hardened suspension of all of our assumptions about Jacobs. One of our goals in bringing out Vital Little Plans was to try to see what more there was to learn about Jacobs by looking at the full range of her life's work. And I think the first thing you learn when you look at Jacobs' life and career whole, from the earliest writings in the 1930s, where Vital Little Plans begins, up to the work she was doing in the 2000s when she died, is that the stuff that we know, we all think we know from Death and Life, was the jumping off point for a host of other work. On cities, yes, and Nate's going to talk about that in some detail, but also on morals and economies. In fact, at the end of her life, she remarked that she hoped she would be best remembered for her economic thinking, for her theories about how city economies drive overall prosperity. So more than a tribune of the ideal neighborhood, Jacobs was perhaps our greatest theorist of the city, not as a modern machine for living, but as a living human system, geared for solving problems through creative, chaotic, improvisational economies. So tonight I'm going to speak briefly about how she took on that problem and what she made of it, but then turn to how her thinking about city economies led to thinking about the future, and can help us see Jacobs as someone with troubling and promising ideas about the future of humanity. Hopefully I'll whet your appetite for more from Jacobs herself. You can turn to Vital Little Plans for further inspiration, and to the short sort of initial piece of this second book, a short biography of the human race that she was working on when she died. But let's start back in the 60s and 70s, when Jacobs turned to the problems of urban economies. This is, of course, at a time when cities and whole nations in the West seemed to be in decline. In Death and Life, she had shown that modern planning schemes were misguided attempts to revive city life. But she felt, along with a host of other people observing economies, urban life, during the age of the so-called urban crisis, that something more pervasive, something more odious was afoot in these years. Something deeper. What had gone wrong in city life? In true Jacobs fashion, she took inspiration from the vital city life that she admired and flipped the question on its head. The quandary, she said, was not why cities stagnated, but why they grew in the first place. Poverty, she says, has no causes. Only prosperity has causes. Figure out how economic growth worked, and the causes of the era's problems would become clear. And these were the major questions of her work from the 1960s up through the 1980s. Across parts 3 and 4 of Vital Little Plans, one can watch Jacobs distilling the chief lessons of her years spent thinking about city economies. And these are the lessons that would go into the 2 major books that she wrote after Death and Life. Cities and the Wealth of Nations, and, say it for me, The Economy of Cities, right? I'm always getting all her books confused in my mind. And these books that came after Death and Life, right, are less read by many, harder to get into, harder to read, somewhat theoretical, somewhat complex. But they're quite interesting once you spend some time with them, and you're able to, I think in our book, to spend some time with some of these ideas in a way that's a little bit more easy to get into. She considered these ideas, as I said, the most important of her career, and near the end of her life, she returned to them in the second book she was working on when she died, which she tentatively was calling Uncovering the Economy. And she hoped this would fully explain her vision. She never finished that book either, but the opening section of that book is published in Vital Little Plans for the first time, and it reveals her final understanding of how economic growth unfolds. In short, and I won't go into all the details, Jacobs argues that healthy cities are where what she called, quote, new work springs up, and where cycles of import replacing and export production that lead to intense bursts of economic growth rise up as well. The dense fabric of interdependencies in cities incubate economic expansion and innovation at large. Cultivating vibrant urban centers with small, diverse commercial and industrial enterprises is the linchpin of any meaningful strategy for Jacobs to combat decline in that era, and really in any era to sort of fuel the fires and stoke the fires of urban growth and prosperity for all. At its core, one might say, Jacobs' vision is something we might call markets without capitalism. Markets, she thinks, are a source not only of alienation, but of exchange and contact, not simply building blocks of national productivity, but wellsprings of new ideas and self-making in concert with others. Jacobs' own vision is one of what we might call sober Schumpeterianism. She had an interest in promoting a more democratic, measured form of the creative destruction that the economist Joseph Schumpeter famously identified as the engine of capitalism. She believed in the dynamism of markets, of capitalism, its propensity to require new innovative work to grow, to push things forward, to ensure a future, but wanted to preserve the democratic spirit of this process in a society that favors established interests. All kinds of new local work, she thought, drove economies. Small, young enterprises and their employees, she argued, need protection from corrosive concentrations of bureaucratic power, whether those were governmental or corporate, whether they were private or whether they were public. The just city and the just nation is a place where anyone's creative impulses to dicker and improvise and reinvent themselves would be unleashed, where everyone would have the opportunity to make their own vital little plans. Now, near the end of her life, Jacobs began to think about how to expand this lesson about the fertile growth of economies to the largest scale possible, both in terms of human life and in terms of human history, right? So in space and in time. Sort of ambitious moment at the end of her life where she thought she was going to sort of solve everything, right? With a biography of the human race. Right, so she's exploring in this moment how new work and the creative economies that it gives rise to were the building blocks of newness in general. And she was trying to use it to think about the long human past and its possible futures. Her last major speech, The End of the Plantation Age, which was actually given here in New York in 2004 up at City College, uptown, sees Jacobs developing a theory of human history, one she did not have the chance to complete, but was a companion piece to her last book, Dark Age Ahead. And the speech finds her sort of leavening the gloom of that book's dire worries with the prospect of a profound forward-looking transformation in human history. Okay, so the Plantation Age of her title, for her, is a long era of human history from which she believes we are only now, in this moment of human time, emerging. For centuries, she says, human effort was organized on the top-down plantation model. The term invokes, of course, the horrors of slavery and forced labor, but it also includes industrialization, with its armies of workers enduring routinized, scientifically managed tasks. Unlike other thinkers, whether radical, centrist, or conservative, Jacobs did not see the Industrial Revolution as a fundamental disjuncture in history. To her, the factory was little more than a machine-made plantation. As much as an icon of the age, as urban renewal, as mass suburbs, or as the twin towers of the World Trade Center, as she puts it. This era may have produced great wealth, culminating in the relatively shared prosperity of the mid-20th century boom, but it was always for her just another monoculture, inevitably tending towards stagnation and waste. The plantation mentality used economies of scale and planned results to turn workers into little more than peons, each a potential trader, which was her ideal form of human life, betrayed and wasted. It was a form of production for production's sake that eclipsed the far more vibrant worlds of exchange and everyday improvisation, innovation, and so forth, found in cities enlivened by trade, with their small enterprises, diverse peoples, and mixtures of face-to-face uses. But now, she thought, at the end of her life, at the end of the 20th century, that era might be receding, and what, she wondered, could be on the horizon. Jacobs, as we discussed, as Nate said, never relished the role of prophet. But right near the end of her life, in the last 5 or 6 years, she hazarded two related but opposite guesses about what might be coming. One path was what she called, in Dark Age Ahead, cultural collapse. And Jacobs found evidence of imminent decline, if you've read that book, in the erosion of family, of community, of science, of education, of governance, and of what she called professional integrity in North America. She, as Nate said, identified the danger of the housing bubble just as it was inflating in the early years of the millennium. More than a decade later, I guess we'd say that it's hard not to remain dismayed in a time of renewed inequality, recalcitrant structural racism, with the excesses of financial capitalism detached from productivity, fresh in so many people's minds. The sort of sober balance between creativity and destruction that Jacobs hoped for appears considerably out of whack. Now, more orthodox thinkers on the left or right might consider these outcomes endemic to their usual targets, right? Capitalism, or big government, or privatization, or the welfare state. Jacobs, however, offered a different story, a possible path out of what she saw as a morass, a gathering stagnation. In that last speech, she spied signs of not a dark age coming, but what she called an age of human capital, in which humans might find a way to return by way of their creative impulses to an era when the capacity for exchange and new work will once again drive growth, while imperial expansion and control over resources wither as a means of holding power. Societies that harness their tremendous capacity, collective capacity for ingenuity and embrace the organized complexity of city life, another one of her famous phrases, will free their citizens from industrial and agricultural peonage and thrive. If history, she said, during the Plantation Age was mainly a contest over land and resources, reaching its bloody depths in European imperialism or the Nazi pursuit of Lebensraum, in the age of human capital, this may no longer be the primary way to secure prosperity. Land and resources, Jacobs observes, quote, can be held exclusively Ingenuity cannot be. This deceptively simple observation suggests new understandings of her earlier insights across her career into cities and economies. If the Plantation Age was a zero-sum game in which mastery over land, labor, and resources guaranteed power, the age of human capital is a non-zero-sum game with a more complex, unpredictable, and hopefully equitable set of rules and outcomes. So Jacobs never finished her own work, and she was, until the end, quite mindful of the possibility that any innovative tendencies could be betrayed by the lure of plantation-style bigness. It's fitting, though, that in her final speech, she would not accept that the future was foreclosed. Her radical pragmatism in this, as in all things, led her to look for the ways that people might live in the flow of their own time, and in making do with what they have, also try to make their world anew. So whatever one thinks of her diagnoses and prognostications near the end of her life, I have my doubts about some of these things, and I think they certainly sort of rely on a kind of robust faith in the essential goodness and industriousness of people that makes them seem a bit naive at times, which is sort of an odd thing to say about someone as savvy as Jane Jacobs, right? Nate may have some things to say about that too. I still think this remains a good time, a good moment, at this moment, and perhaps in this hinge moment in human history, to return to Jacobs, beset as we are by any number of trials, right? Whether it's the threat of climate change, the dovetailing of globalization and automation, persistent poverty and inequality, the twin perils of terrorism and nationalism. Longtime followers of Jacobs will relish, I think, returning to her for fresh problem-solving inspiration on these problems. As she said, as we negotiate the difficult transition out of the dead but not buried plantation age, we need unlimited independent thinkers with unlimited skepticism and curiosity. So if a new generation of readers and independent thinkers find it galvanizing to discover her bracing, plain-spoken talent for revealing the interwoven problems of cities, economies, and morals, as they can do in Vital Little Plans, I think we can all take heart knowing that even in her last years, she was still sort of pushing on, offering us a new vision of death and of life for a new century. So thanks. Nate will tell us some more about her city ideas.
Great. So, yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that I think Sandy sort of pointed out is that, at the end of her life, she returned to this same idea of death and life, right? And something that she always pointed out was that she had reversed the title. We're so used to hearing life and death, and she made a point of reversing it to kind of emphasize the hope in the future about, where we could go. And I think that some of what I'm about to say will kind of touch on that a little bit. So, The Death and Life of Great American Cities is sort of this classic book, and really the crux of it is that she was analyzing the importance of street life, people being out on the street, right? The importance of that to the economy, the fact that retail thrives on that, and there's so many small businesses that rely upon that, but also all the social things that rely upon that neighbors know one another and are able to organize, that there's sort of these informal sorts of things that you take for granted sometimes, at least in her time, parenting, for instance, allowing your children to play on the street and trusting that some of your neighbors might look out for them if something happens, right? Stopping crimes, right? Her famous phrase, eyes on the street, comes from this idea that if there's more people out on the street, it's a safer street. But what was lying behind that whole street life was what she called these 4 generators of diversity, which she thought brought people out on the street. So just to quickly go through them, concentration, which is very, relevant to this museum, the idea that we need a lot of people in a city to actually make that work. Mixed primary uses, meaning we need a mix of residential and workplaces, places where people visit, so that people are actually out on the street at different times of day. If everyone's all out at lunch, but then it's dead after work, then that area could be dangerous, it's not as good for business, and so forth. Small blocks, which simply means that way people can mingle their paths, right? People can actually be in the same place at the same time rather than being separated by the blocks that are in the way. And then finally, aged buildings, which simply means old, cheap, run-down, crappy buildings. Cheap space for businesses, mostly, to incubate new businesses and new ideas. So I'm going to go through each one of these and just kind of open up a few pathways that mostly go through Vital Little Plans and some of her short works, her writings and her speeches, and take these a little bit further than I think we're used to. If you're familiar with this book, I feel like a lot of these seem settled. Like, yeah, we're already doing that. You know, architects and planners are already kind of know this stuff. It's settled, it's taught in school. But maybe we could take it a step further. So, with that, I'm going to start with concentration, which I think seems like a good place to start with the Skyscraper Museum. So Jacobs thought that density was a crucial ingredient for urban diversity. But recently, she's had a lot of flack from folks like the economist Ed Blazer, who believed that she was actually anti-density. So I'm going to kind of dig into that a little bit. But let me just start by saying they're wrong. She was not against density, and in fact, in Death and Life, she calls both of these buildings modern masterpieces. And this is what she had to say about Lower Manhattan. What is more dramatic, even romantic, than the tumbled towers of Lower Manhattan rising suddenly to the clouds like a magic castle girdled by water? Its very touch of jumbled jaggedness, its tower-sided canyons are its magnificence. So, in general though, Jane Jacobs was sort of agnostic about skyscrapers. They could be good, they could be bad. And this quote, I think, sums it up perfectly. What are proper densities for city dwellings? The answer to this is something like the answer Lincoln gave to the question, how long should a man's legs be? Long enough to reach the ground, Lincoln said. Just so, proper city dwelling densities are a matter of performance. What she was getting at was that really what matters is the extent to which the building adds to the diversity of the city. It came down to whether a building added to the diversity or sacrificed it on the altar of maximum efficiency. So this is actually a good example from my neighborhood of I think what she was worried about. This is 4th Avenue in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. And pretty much every property owner on this stretch of the street, and it goes on and on and on, 6-story elevator apartment buildings. There's absolutely nothing else. Occasionally you get a school or church, there's no businesses, there's no other uses. And I think that this is a really good example of kind of what she was getting at. And it's not a problem that's specifically about density. It's just a matter of anything that creates a monoculture, which is a word that I think Sandy pointed out earlier. So at any given point, she says, technology, regulations, and styles dictate the most efficient way to pack people onto land. But if everyone follows that same strategy, things get very boring and dysfunctional. So her other objection about skyscrapers had nothing to do with the height of buildings at all. Like any big project, it had to do with what it replaced. And the World Trade Center is a really instructive example of what she had a problem with. Radio Row. So before the towers were built, there was this neighborhood there called Radio Row. And when it was demolished, Jacobs lamented the loss of the open-ended, fine-grained economy that was emerging there. There was an economic community that existed. The businesses of Radio Row were regarded as pathetically small, and their protests about what was to happen to them were jokes to city, state, and federal power brokers and their experts, she said. No one can say whether the ruined Radio Row might or might not have evolved into a major asset in the city's and region's economy. All we know is that it was a sort of prehistoric Silicon Valley for a short time. Meanwhile, these supposedly rational towers had trouble finding tenants and glutted the office market in New York. As Jacobs tells it, at least, these towers got by at all only by grace of decades of public subsidies and spin-doctored information. So Jacobs had an alternative idea of what density might look like that didn't involve displacing anyone, and that was infill. So as early as 1957, Jane Jacobs was advocating for more efficient use of urban land. Specifically, she saw that efficient ground coverages, as in less open space, meant that the buildings themselves didn't have to be so efficient. So tightly packed land could support a diversity of heights and shapes of buildings, and therefore a diversity of different kinds of lifestyles. So this is a picture of the West Village houses in Greenwich Village, and they are 42 5-story walk-ups that Jacobs helped develop after she stopped Robert Moses' urban renewal plans there. And while the architectural details and mixed-use design of the original buildings was scraped away by government obstruction and delays caused by construction costs, this was Jacobs' first attempt to demonstrate an alternative path to density. And she talks about this in a number of speeches in the book. But in Toronto, she found local architects and a city administration that was far more capable of experimentation. So these are the Dundas Sherborne houses in Toronto. The old Victorian homes in front were slated for demolition to be replaced with a Tower in the Park affordable housing complex. But after community protests, led partly by Jane Jacobs, the city negotiated on behalf of the community with the province, and these infill units were built in the backyards of the original houses. They house the same number of people as the towers would have, with no demolition. Because of their irregular shapes, they also work for a huge variety of tenants, from families with kids on the lower floors to apartments for single people, to elderly couples, and a boarding house for elderly men. This development started a new arm of Toronto's affordable housing regime that specialized in infill. And you can see evidence of this regime all throughout the city still today. Jacobs and her colleagues in Toronto also applied this infill mentality to a plan for an entire new neighborhood in Toronto called St. Lawrence, which was built on a swath of empty downtown land near the railway and the expressway. The most remarkable thing about this 1970s project is that people don't even notice when they walk into it, or know that it was built basically all at once over the course of a decade. Guided by an open-ended, evolving planning document, a mix of private, public, and co-op developers produced a neighborhood with a real mix of uses, ownership models, levels of subsidy, and high-rise and low-rise buildings. One standout, which you can actually see in the upper left corner, is a building that combines a Catholic school with ground floor retail and apartments above, which I've never seen anywhere else. So, on that note, I'm going to move into mixed primary uses, which I think connects to that idea of just how mixed use are things that we actually do today. I mean, a Catholic school with ground floor retail and apartments is a very unusual mix, and maybe we could, open up our mind a little bit about where we could go with this. I think we're kind of used to thinking about mixed-use developments now in this way. This is a picture of False Creek in Vancouver, and it sort of pioneered a style of building that people call Vancouverism. And it basically just means a tall tower, residential tower above, and then on the bottom you have these podiums, commercial podiums with ground floor retail. And the buildings are spaced far enough apart that it maintains views, it doesn't shadow things or cause wind problems as much. And I think this is sort of what my picture of mixed-use development is these days. That's what every new development seems to look like, more or less. Sometimes they're mid-rise. Or it might look like this, a redevelopment of some old building, whether it's an old factory or an old wholesaling district of some kind, like these two festival marketplaces, Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco and Quincy Market in Boston. But what if we thought about this whole idea of mixed use in a much more broad way? So this is Hong Kong, Chungking Mansions in Hong Kong. And near the end of her life, Jane Jacobs actually visited Hong Kong, and it sort of changed her mind about skyscrapers. As much as she was fairly agnostic, I think in practice she was often not on board with high-rise developments. But when she saw that high-rises could be used this way, it really opened something in her mind. So it goes all the way up. Sorry, this did have better transitions at one point. So there is the whole thing. But I think the key point about this is that there's actually a mixture of uses all throughout the building. So to give you an idea of just how mixed use this is, this is a 17-story building that contains 4,000 residents, nearly 2,000 hotel rooms, and 3 shopping malls. It receives about 10,000 visitors a day from around 120 countries a year. That is an intensive use of urban land. It's also even anarchically mixed use. And to Jacobs, that's actually a good thing. Years after death and life, she began advocating that we should just abolish land use planning altogether, zoning. Just get rid of it. Not that we don't need to plan, but that land use zoning is the wrong tool. Instead, she said, it could be replaced by simple performance metrics. So in other words, a factory could locate directly adjacent to a single-family home so long as it behaved like a single-family home. After years of community meetings, Jacobs collected 6 metrics that came up most often, which she thought could provide a framework for this kind of zoning. So noise, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. If it's too loud, it's a problem. Pollution, again, pretty obvious. Scale, which she actually defined as the width of street frontage. So we're not talking about height. We're talking about how much space it takes up on the street. And her point was that you could have a huge mix of heights so long as the storefronts are so narrow. And if you actually look at the Empire State Building in New York and just stand there for a few minutes, you'll watch countless tourists walk by and have no idea where the Empire State Building is. Because the street is just part of the street. It doesn't look like a skyscraper at the ground floor. Signage, again, very straightforward, but people complain a lot about it. How garish is it? How big is it? How much light is it emitting? Traffic generation. This one is a little trickier, but again, how much parking does a place need? And we actually often do have parking regulations around new development, but usually it's a minimum rather than a maximum. And then finally, destruction. What can't you tear down, right? Could be buildings, could also be trees. One of the examples she gives is trees over a certain girth, that you cannot tear down. So why not? And she thought that essentially a community could sort of agree on these basic metrics, and then after that, the building is essentially, can just go wild. Interestingly, in 1996, inspired by Jane Jacobs, Toronto actually did this. They removed land use zoning from 400 acres of the downtown. And as a developer friend of mine put it, you could build a nuclear bomb in the area so long as you don't tear down the building and you're quiet and neighborly. Since the designation in 1996, the areas have gained an additional 46,000 residential units, 20,000 jobs, about $8 billion of building investment, and $7 billion of economic activity. Other cities are also following suit. 2 I just heard about last week, actually, which were strange. West Sacramento in California is dezoning an industrial district. And Little Rock, Arkansas just dezoned its downtown. So we'll see how that goes. But some questions do remain about whether the 2 kings in Toronto, as they call them, are becoming a victim of their own success, and I'll return to that a little bit later. But as technology keeps advancing, performance zoning becomes more and more feasible as well. So this is a quote from Dan Doctoroff, who spoke at the MAS Summit 2 years ago. Yeah, he argued that with the emerging Internet of Things, right, sensors and everything, computers and everything, sensors could replace cumbersome zoning to allow greater flexibility in our cities. Right? What if every building, even every room, could measure the noise being created, the smells being emitted, the activity going on at odd hours, and what if you could enforce against those violations in a meaningful, automatic way? It sounds kind of authoritarian, frankly, right? But, I was thinking about this, and what if it was an opt-in program? You didn't have to follow land use zoning so long as you submitted to having sensors in your building. I bet a lot of people would do it. Just look at those agreements that you sign online.
This is the problem.
Right, exactly. So, small blocks, right? This is a very simple one, but I think it's really interesting. Jacobs' point about short blocks was dead simple. If intersections are more frequent, people have more opportunities to mingle. Whether you're talking about it socially or economically, there's more opportunities for small businesses to parse out the kind of consumer that they actually need to stay alive if everyone is going through the same places, or if they can. And perhaps surprisingly, she used Rockefeller Center as a perfect example of this. Unlike so many other redevelopment schemes, Rockefeller Center actually adds a street, breaking up a few of Manhattan's long east-west blocks. Rockefeller Plaza, as the street is called, runs from 48th down to 48th up to 51st, rushing past the iconic rink along the way. And she talks about how this adds so much foot traffic to the street, and it also provides a pathway that people desperately need, and they even cut through some of the buildings on the north side to continue it even further. In some ways, this idea of a connected street network has been actually the most heated of all of these Jane Jacobs tenets, I think. Walkability, for instance, has become an everyday word, and we even have websites to measure the walk score of our neighborhoods. So this is an Ngram, which basically measures mentions of the word walkability in books. I did it from 1900 up to the present. So you can see there's actually a little bump rate where Jane Jacobs published Death and Life, and then a steady increase through the 1990s that's just exploded. We also have so many tools to start measuring these street networks, to see the density of intersections, the continuity of the grid, the dead ends. And so, these are just two examples of the same city. I think it's Milan. Sorry about that. But essentially, this measures the centrality of the entire city. This is not Rockefeller Center. And this actually shows some of the main arterial roads and how it connects to the sort of sub-roads of the network. But since that is maybe settled territory a little bit, so let's talk about some of the other ways that people get from place to place and mingle their paths. Jacobs loved to cycle. That's her right there. But when she rode her bike to work in the 1940s and 50s, she used to get catcalled all the time. "Get a horse," they would yell, or "Watch out, girlie, you'll get hurt." I found this interesting. So today, Jane Jacobs could make her entire commute to work on bike lanes. I think she'd be pretty happy about that. So that is her house over in Greenwich Village, and that is Rockefeller Center right up there. I'm not sure, though, how she would feel about the state of our broader transportation infrastructure these days. She hardly wrote about them at all in Death and Life, which I find really interesting. It's amazing that she hardly mentions subways in New York. But many of the articles and speeches about transportation made it into Vital Little Plans. So for one, Jane Jacobs actually spoke at the first Earth Day in 1970, and one of the major topics that she touched on was America's failure to develop and implement new transportation technologies. The streetcar, or subway, the car, the airplane were essentially developed a century ago now, and yet we're still dependent on variations of these same three modes. She pointed out that so many emerging technologies in America had not been put into application because they were too damaging to the status quo, too disruptive, as we might say these days. One of them was this, the Alden Star Car, an automated door-to-door system where riders could simply dial in their destination. It alternated between an express subway-like system at long distances, which you can kind of see here, looks like a subway platform kind of, and then a more car-like system for local stops. So this is what she says about it. The system requires rights of way no wider than a sidewalk to carry more people more rapidly than a 6-lane expressway. In every environmental respect, from pollution to community destruction, it would afford great improvement. The only version ever implemented is still working in Morgantown, West Virginia. But this is a new version of the same idea, which is actually currently in use at Heathrow Airport, believe it or not. But these kinds of settings, these campuses, enclosed campuses, it's the only way that you actually see it applied. However, of course, it does remind me a lot of these, right? Ride-hailing apps, whether you're talking about Uber, Lyft, or Sidecar, or any number of other things. In New York, there's actually a local one called Juno, which is kind of cool. But in fact, she actually kind of predicted that these might happen, which at least that's how I read this quote. It is not likely that manufacturers of vehicles will organize the transportation of the future as they do now, to a considerable extent. The organizing forces rather will be transportation services, including even the services of renting differentiated automobiles for different purposes to individual users. In other words, car ownership, maybe not in the future. That's what she was saying in 1969. However, I do think she'd be disappointed by how monopolized these services have become, largely, except for New York, right? But those sorts of concentrations of power, she was always very skeptical of. But yeah, it's easy to see how ride-hailing apps, self-driving cars, of course, and other systems or other ideas like the Star Car system could kind of come together to radically reshape our cities. And I think really the big question is, to come full circle, what are we going to do with all the extra space? With no on-street parking and far more efficient traffic movement, what will we actually do with that public space? Will it actually facilitate the sidewalk ballet and the local economy that Jane Jacobs would want? Or will we just sell it off to the highest bidder? Or will we engineer it and bureaucratize it into non-existence? All right, and finally, aged buildings. So I'm actually just going to tell all of this through the story of one building, 401 Richmond Street West in Toronto. This is actually a building that I worked in. It's an amazing arts development, and it was actually inspired by Jane Jacobs. It was a family friend who started it. And she took this quote really to heart, and it's the guiding principle of the entire development. Old ideas can sometimes use new buildings. New ideas must use old buildings. And Jane Jacobs' point when she said that was that those low costs are really important for businesses, nonprofits, all sorts of enterprises that don't really make much money, whether at first or ever. And so what the developer of this building wanted to do was provide a space for arts workers who don't make a lot of money and often never make a lot of money on a permanent basis. And the way that she did this was that when she bought the building, it was quite cheap, relatively speaking. I think it was $1.5 million, but this is like a, whatever it is, 200,000 square feet building. And then she very judiciously added things to the building. So, for instance, she just replaced the furnace last year. She's had it for 20 years. This is what it kind of looks like on the inside. It's a mix of galleries, workspaces, and it has all sorts of other stuff as well. Artisans, designers, consultants, architects, developers, media companies, magazines, maintenance contractors, a green energy co-op, dance studios, a therapist, nonprofits, galleries, shops, a daycare, and cafes. So again, talk about mixed use. Torontonians call it a village in a box. But something is happening that is undercutting the affordability of 401 Richmond. So even though, it makes sense, that the Jane Jacobs quote makes sense, old buildings, low costs, something's happening. And actually the key is that the building is in one of the two kings. So these areas that have been deregulated have become incredibly, incredibly popular. And while the limited regulation that they had in place, which basically said you couldn't tear down a building for one thing, while that held, things were okay. But now the city has made a couple exceptions, and now it's impossible to say no to more exceptions. So now there are actually a lot of 80-story luxury condominium developments popping up nearby. And while some argue that building these taller buildings may improve affordability in the city at large, and over the long term, in the short term and at the local level, it's clear the damage that it's creating. So now 401 Richmond is surrounded by these 80-story buildings, meaning that the highest and best use of their land is now also 80-story luxury condo developments. And that means that the property taxes that they pay have gone through the roof accordingly. They are now paying as though they are a luxury condominium development, a brand new one. Tenants who pay property taxes directly to the city will see an 85% increase in their rates this year. And by 2020, their rates will have tripled. Remarkably, though, the tenants drafted a recommendation for a tax policy. These are arts workers working in this building, drafted a tax policy, gave it to the city, and the city is now actually taking it up and arguing for it with the province right now. And so things are actually starting to look up. It looks like they're going to have a special tax code for assessing cultural uses, basically. But the problem with that is that this is not a problem that's isolated to arts workers. It's a problem that applies to all sorts of urban land. So I think really the point of this was a long way of saying that old buildings may provide opportunities for affordable space, but only temporarily. Jacobs was writing about gentrification in 1961 before the term was even coined. So we should really revisit many of the other tools that she wrote about in Death and Life and throughout her career for maintaining affordability, both at the micro scale and at the macro scale. So I'm not going to go into great depth with any of these, but I thought I'd just kind of lay them out a little bit. Build more. This is actually one of the things that she agrees with Ed Glazer about. Our cities just need to build more because we need more supply to meet the demand. And if we stop building, it's going to be a problem. However, we also need to be renewing our public housing, our commitment to public housing, both in terms of the investment that goes into public housing. She was a big believer in this, even though a lot of people think of her as a sort of free market type. She really believed in public housing. And she thought that no matter whether you're building privately or publicly, we need to preserve cheap buildings. And I know that this is where Ed Glazer has some problems with her. He thinks that that's silly. And that by preserving everything, we can't build anything. But as we saw with the infill developments, that's not necessarily true. Even for tall buildings, that's not necessarily true. And you can actually see the problem with this in East New York recently. What's up?
In cheap, you mean cheap in terms of the materials or the cost of the building?
The current cost of the building. So in terms of older buildings where they're superannuated, all of their initial building costs have been paid off. At least that's what Jacobs was talking about when she's talking about these aged buildings.
But sturdy, we're talking.
Yeah, sturdy, yes. And honestly, safe, but maybe not sturdy, right? There's sort of a lot of gray area in between. But in Oakland recently, there was that horrible fire in an arts building that was, not up to code. So you have to be careful with this stuff. But there is a little bit of a middle ground, I think. But yeah, so in East New York, there was this big scandal a little while ago, maybe a couple years now, about the rezoning of East New York. And a report came out that basically said, well, if you tear down all of these houses and build all this housing, even though it has inclusionary zoning, the new inclusionary units, the affordable units, are unaffordable to the people who lived there at the time. Right? So even though at the macro scale we have to keep building, how do we also maintain affordability in the short term and not displace all sorts of people? It's a really challenging problem. I don't mean to downplay it. Promote ownership. This is sort of a classic prescription that a lot of people give. But I think that there's some truth to it. And she really took it a step further by saying, well, we really promote home ownership a lot in the United States. But what about business ownership? What about owning commercial space? Because those small business owners are affected just as much by gentrification and affordability issues as homeowners. So why don't we have a program for that, a policy for that? And similarly, she also was big on collective ownership models. Why not? Co-ops, land trusts, all of these sorts of tools that we could really start making better use of. Reform property taxes. And I think this becomes clear with the 401 Richmond case, where you can own your building and you may still be paying rent to the city or the province or whoever. And so she made the point that potentially what you could do is think about property taxes as paying for the use value of the building rather than the market value of the building. So you're talking about the materials, the amount of land it takes up, the number of floors. Those things actually don't really change. And obviously if you change them, then your taxes would change. But when you're talking about market values, if something happens in your neighborhood, even though your use has not changed, and you may not be making any more money from your job or from the building itself, you'll still have to pay more property taxes. And that causes a lot of problems. And then finally, divert competition. So this is sort of one of her more potentially controversial points, but essentially what she was saying is there aren't enough neighborhoods that are gentrifying. And I know that's a little tricky, but I guess what she was getting at was that there are huge swaths of almost every city now that are incredibly poor and have no opportunity. In other words, the problem, much as Sandy was saying, is not a problem of abundance of affluence, but a lack of it. There aren't enough people moving into the middle class. So what she said was that the most fundamental way to mitigate gentrification was to help the people in those outlying neighborhoods improve their lot in life and reinvest in their own communities. Property values may rise, in other words, but so will the capability of residents to keep up. So that's something that's incredibly untested. We don't know if that's true, and it's incredibly hard to actually track it. So it's an open-ended question, but if that's true, then it might do us a lot of good to figure it out. So, to close, I want to suggest that one common theme for all of these sorts of divergent paths that take death and life into new directions, I think, boil down to one thing. At base, Jane Jacobs believed that we should always seek to create more and more niches in the city for people's lives and livelihoods. More and more opportunities for people to make their own vital little plans. And so I think this quote really sums up her take on the future nicely. Planning is foresight. The future is what it is all about. Yet big plans, in which everything has been foreseen as far as possible, stifle alternative possibilities and new departures. To plan for the future and at the same time stifle fresh possibilities is a contradiction in terms. Thank you.
We're open for discussion. Are there any questions in the audience to start out?
Affordable for cheap.
Okay, we'll take that. We'll note that.
Is cheap Jane's word?
I'm not sure actually what she says. She doesn't really talk about affordability though, per se. Yeah, I'm not sure. Anyway.
So I would have two questions, basically. One of it regards landmarking, and the fact that when you landmark entire districts, you are effectively reducing your ability to create heterogeneous neighborhoods because things are just going to be wrapped in saran and never change until such time as a future generation decides they don't like it. And the other is the new sensibility that we have to have regarding pollution, climate change, etc. Because old buildings are very, very difficult to fit into the reduction of pollution as opposed to new buildings which you can really make extremely efficient.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think on the first point, I'm not actually sure where Jane Jacobs stood on the landmarking of entire districts, but I would hazard a guess that she was not for it. She was definitely for landmarking of specific buildings, but I think the idea that you could freeze a neighborhood in amber is exactly as you said, is something that's kind of antithetical to what she was all about, which is really gradual change. Cataclysmic change she was against as well, but that constant gradual churning is really important for her. As for pollution, I've heard arguments and counter-arguments either way, because a lot of the new buildings, they have a lot of really complicated solutions to actually simple problems. And there's a lot of vernacular architecture, for instance, that deals very well with certain environmental concerns in a much simpler way, including like lots of low-rise buildings that already exist in cities. And that may not be the case in New York. So I do think that there are some challenges in terms of retrofitting our buildings here. But I'll leave it there.
Would you say that her thinking is largely formulated based on the vitality of New York or Toronto? How would she see what took place in, say, Detroit or other industrial kind of communities?
So it seems to me that essentially Jacobs thinks that those places were monocultures. Those were places that relied way too heavily on one vision of how to organize their economies. She understood the ways that to take Detroit, right? The auto industry created spillover effects and created subsidiary businesses that clustered around the auto industry. But she would have. But I think what we can take from thinking of the way Jacobs did was to see that those were still dependent on the rise and fall, the fate of one particular idea and one particular form of organizing labor, and one sort of idea about what worked for the marketplace. And one nationalized form of what worked for the marketplace. So as to cluster all those things into one place and gear your entire economy around them, and to imagine that as a model for national planning, which it certainly was in the era after Detroit was identified as the arsenal of democracy in the 40s forward, was, I think, a major mistake if we think in Jacobsian terms. Even to the point where we can see that Detroit was, in a sense, a model that worked for some people and not for other people. In a sense, was already hollowing out, particularly for African Americans by the 1950s and 60s, and then for everybody by the 70s and 80s, in the sense that it was easy to transport that economy to the suburbs and then to other countries. And so, yeah, I think the form that she would have preferred, and that I think that we can take from thinking about Jacobs's ideas, is to think about ways that you disperse different kinds of uses to smaller niche kinds of uses, and to ways that empower individuals to do things rather than great big bureaucracies, whether they be private or public. So that would be the idea.
So small coal mining towns would fall into that same issue.
Well, that's actually where she came from, a small coal mining town, Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And she actually did all sorts of economic studies of the anthracite coal mining industry and sort of the decline of it and what the challenges it was facing at the time.
One of the interesting stories from her early years is that she wrote on behalf of Scranton early in her career as a writer, trying to get it in the 40s during World War II, trying to get war plants to relocate in Scranton. She worked for a magazine called Iron Age at the time, which was a trade magazine for the iron industry, and she organized with the editor to petition the federal government to move plants to Scranton during those years. An idea that we imagine she probably later, although we don't know that we have any proof of this, would later have thought to have been somewhat misguided.
Yeah, well, she makes a point in her later works of saying how misguided this idea of relocating war plants and war work in general, relying on war work was. And it probably has something to do with that. But also that campaign is probably her first real public campaign as an activist.
Yeah.
Which is pretty interesting.
It's interesting to see the change in her thought over the course of her career.
But one more thing I would say about Detroit as well is that in terms of the built form, I think one of her big points was not only does it only work for sort of a narrow swath of people at a certain time, but when the conditions change, the built form of Detroit was not very resilient, right? In the sense that it's, for instance, if people, if it's built entirely relying on the car, and you actually see this in Toronto too, and then suddenly the people who move in don't have a car, can't afford a car, their car breaks down, whatever, and they have to walk everywhere, it's disastrous. And Toronto has huge swaths of what we call tower neighborhoods that were built for middle-class young families with cars. And it's now one of the most international parts of the city, and the vast majority of those people are huge families that don't have cars. And it's a big problem in terms of the built form. It's not a resilient form. I think that's really one way that you can think about those four generators of diversity, is something that can change over time and accommodate a wide variety of different kinds of populations.
And not just the car, but also the single-family house. Which is really
you also mentioned that you never talked about public transportation, and that just is an argument to what you just said, that Toronto has at least something, Detroit doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely.
It abandoned
and New York is blossoming because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Detroit abandoned its public transportation system, like most American cities. Streetcar,
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting, because that's what Moses is thinking too. You go down and look at the model over at Queens Museum, and you don't see a public mass transit layout whatsoever.
Yeah, right.
Well, cities owe their density to their mass transit systems. I mean, you couldn't have that concentration. I heard the number, you'd have to, if you replace the subway system, you'd need a 2 square mile, 6-story garage and 392 lanes of highway.
Right, right. One of the classic things in Death and Life that she talks about is the fact that if you just keep doing the math around car traffic, eventually the city destroys itself. Because it's this constant induced demand that eventually you need so much road that there's no city left. It's sort of an insoluble formula. Any other questions?
Yeah, I know. So thank you for that presentation. It was really marvelous. I guess I'm curious, does she ever, this is sort of fill in the blanks between the various work she's already put out, but does she ever talk about sort of the hinterlands as places where resources are extracted? And I guess we touched on this with the coal town, but supporting all those highly specialized and interdependent niches and creative spaces requires a lot of infrastructure, farms, or factories that probably don't make sense to have in the city and are maybe in different countries and across borders. So there's a whole network that supports that. Does she ever talk about what that looks like and how it's supporting?
Did everyone hear that?
No?
Want to repeat it?
Sure.
I think you'll answer that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's a great question. So basically, what about the hinterland? She really focused on cities, but what about all of the resource extraction and sort of peripheral areas of an economy that are absolutely necessary to these functioning economies? And so she did write about that in Cities and the Wealth of Nations. So basically that book is sort of split in two. The first one is about regional economies and how cities sort of spread out these 5 forces that she sort of identified throughout its immediate region and then through all these different peripheral areas. So things like, for instance, jobs, right? Some certain rural areas are cleared out because of urban jobs. I think particularly when she was younger, that was a much more prominent sort of fact of life. But then also things like resource extraction, and sort of the way that she phrased it was that these areas were sort of deformed economies, in the sense that they're incredibly lopsided. when you look at a city, it has all of these 5 forces. I wish I could remember all of them off the top of my head, but they were all contained in balance within the city. And once you get into broader areas, they're sort of out of balance and can cause as many problems as they do solve. You know, particularly with resource extraction, what happens when it runs out, right? Or what happens when the market changes and you don't need it anymore. There's a lot of, again, they're not resilient, I guess.
I mean, one could argue that we still live with this problem today. I mean, essentially, you might say this is the rural-urban divide that we are currently living through in this country. That's, you know, deforming, and to use Jacob's language, so much of our politics and and I don't know, but I don't know that she actually gives us a great way to solve this problem. In a sense, that's what you're suggesting, right? You're suggesting where are we going to locate the sort of engines of these larger economies, if the niches are happening in cities. I think she would have said, you know, I don't know quite, I hesitate, and we often hesitate to try to say exactly what Jacobs would have said is a dangerous game. But I think that you know, she had great faith in the idea that this could all be spread out, and that everybody could, and as I said, that everybody could make their own lives and make the society run through their own initiative in taking up these challenges. You know, I think that's one of the challenges for thinking with Jacobs.
There are also 2 sort of like harsher answers that come from that book. And one of them is that she really didn't believe in rural subsidies. She believed in all sorts of other subsidies, but she didn't believe in long-term rural subsidies. She believed that in a lot of ways that was sort of, there was no economic development happening. Whether you agree with that or not, that was sort of her belief. But she also thought that part of the problem was that because of the way that nation states work, they kind of like to reduce all of the cities that it encompasses to one important city. So for instance, Canada, basically, Montreal was sort of the center of gravity, and now Toronto is the center of gravity. And the other cities are all sort of regional capitals, but they can't possibly be at the same level. And America is kind of a little bit of an exception to that, but maybe it's just going through a transition, and it's hard to tell. There's a lot of cities jockeying, but it's, you know, at any one time. But LA and New York obviously are both, you know, competing heavyweights.
Well, one of the things it suggests, and perhaps, is that if you follow some of the logic of this out, is that a way to distribute these things across hinterlands would be to actually to devolve political and economic responsibility and power to regional clusters of cities, right? And so, I mean, I often think that if you take some of this thought, it's sort of endpoint, that you would break up the United States, right, into a series of regional places surrounding big cities, and that then maybe they would grow their own economies. She was big into local currencies, right? They would have their own currencies. They would have, you would work out all kinds of ways that, particularly in our technological age, those currencies would be instantly transferable with one another technologically, but that you would get these network economies between regions and clusters of areas that would function together, but would be administratively, politically, economically separate in certain kinds of ways, so as to cluster their effects in a smaller economic region. Yeah. I assume this would throw up all kinds of problems that I can't foresee, but I assume. But this is sort of the way that Jacobs, you feel Jacobs moving.
Well, kind of. I mean, she would actually, I think, be potential. She might have been against the EU because
way too top down.
Right. I mean, I think so. She was actually a big proponent of separatism. She wrote a book about Quebec separatism, basically arguing that not really that it was morally right, but just that it made sense, I guess. And part of it was this whole idea of having a local currency that really responded to the needs of that community. I mean, so to come back to Detroit, right? Detroit and New York have the same dollar. Right? And yet Detroit's economy is completely different and has completely different needs right now than New York does, right? In terms of like the cost of labor, in terms of all sorts of things. And her argument was that potentially if you had these more localized currencies, things would be more adaptive to their circumstances, and you wouldn't have these problems where Detroit can't adapt because when its economy changed, the currency didn't change.
So
that's her argument.
I mean, I wonder where she would be on the euro. Because I think she'd say, you know, one thought out of her thinking is to break it up even further, and you'd have all these clusters of little European currencies interacting with each other and they'd be instantly transferable on your phone, but they'd be separate from each other.
Right. They'd have different values,
Right.
even though they'd be interchangeable in terms of buying things.
I hesitate to speak more about things that I'm not qualified to speak about, but it's just sort of the way that it seems like some of her thinking in Cities and the Wealth of Nations was going.
So right here in New York, we're having, at this point in time, big controversies going on in the garment district. You guys
Oh
familiar
yeah,
with
right.
that?
I saw the
I'm following
headlines,
that a
but
little
All
I
right.
won't.
So in a nutshell, what's going on there is that the city's trying to encourage the garment industry to move to Brooklyn, where there's a lot of land at reduced rents.
To Sunset Park or to
Sunset
yeah.
Park is the location where,
Industry City.
Oh right,
City.
the, right.
in that neighborhood.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they're trying to make the garment district, by means of reduced rents, move, encouraging that to happen.
Right.
They can't make it happen. What do you think would be Jane Jacobs' view of changing, the ethnicality of the garment
Yeah.
district?
I mean, it's always a dangerous game to speculate, but I will speculate. Because I actually talked to her son about this today, about this very issue, and he sort of implied that she would be appalled. Well, because it's
Appalled at which part?
At-
Moving or not moving?
at the moving, because I think the point is, I read some articles about this. Yeah, a lot of the people who work in the government district do come from Brooklyn. A lot of them come from Queens
And the Bronx.
and the Bronx. Well, how are they going to get down to Sunset Park, right? You have the commutes, right? You also have the fact that all of these people right now are located next to specific neighbors and have relationships with those neighbors, economic relationships, social relationships. You cannot just pick up an economy and move it somewhere. It's like picking up a piece of the rainforest and saying, oh, we'll just move it over there, right? What about, there's an intricate network of things that's happening in the garment district, and yeah, and it's very difficult to imagine moving it wholesale in any meaningful way. That's what I think she would.
Yeah,
Because the government
It functions like a large
the
factory,
fish market up
and
to the
it
ground.
can't be moved unless you move it all at once. The government doesn't have the authority. This was proposed in the 20s and 30s to move to the Bronx, and it didn't take off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's actually, so I used to work in Boston, and I showed a picture of Quincy Market. It used to be a wholesaling district, right? And it's amazing how much that history has been erased because it was a successful urban renewal project, basically. It was an urban renewal project that happened at the very tail end of the sort of regime, and at the sort of in the nick of time, someone said we should preserve this instead of tearing it down. They preserved it. They turned it into this giant mall, basically. And because it was successful for like 20 years, people don't even talk about the wholesalers that were there before. And they were dispersed throughout the city. The flour people went over there, the meat people went over there, and the vegetable people went over there. A bunch of them didn't make the move, right? And then just this past year, I think, or maybe 2 years ago now, when Boston was going to win the bid for the Olympics, right? They were going to be the American bid for the Olympics, and people said, no way, basically. They were going to move the wholesalers again. They were going to move them from their modernized location at, I can't remember what it's called, basically between a highway and a rail line. They were going to move them again and build something there. So it's like, it's still going on.
Again, it's transportation. They tried to move the design center to Long Island City, Queens, and it struggled for a while, and then ultimately imploded.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, one of the things that's great about reading in Vital Little Plans is her very earliest writings about just these sorts of niche economies, right? So she wrote about the leather district, the fur district, the flower district, and the diamond district,
Yep.
right? And we have a couple of these in the book. They were from Vogue magazine, of all places. And she wrote about the worlds that they created and the interpenetrating worlds that they created.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get a sense for her early on discovering urbanism and discovering the city through her discovery of these economic niches. And it's really where you see her kind of where you see her ideas really begin to flower and begin to germinate. This is in the 1930s when she first arrives in New York as a high school dropout. Yeah, so, sorry, not a high school dropout.
College dropout.
College dropout,
There you
yeah,
go.
someone who didn't go to college, right? Who skipped college to try to go to New York and become a writer. She was a high school graduate. But I think this gets at the sense that she had that the problem, what it's always a problem to do is to try to sort people and their various uses out by some sort of what she called in Death and Life turf, and then kind of sort them across the landscape however someone decides they need to be
Right, because it's for their own good,
Yeah.
basically, by someone's standards.
Or in this case, for the larger good.
Or for
of
the greater
city,
good,
right.
right.
Yeah, and that is tempting, but I don't know.
But the problem with the garment industry is, A, it originally existed for a reason that no longer exists. B, it is subject to intense gentrification and nobody can really afford to be there. And C, it's such a small diminution of what it used to be that there's really no reason except historical precedents why it's there now, because nobody would have ever produced the garment industry today
In
where
that
it
spot,
is.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, this is the great crux of the problem we face right now as we try to think with Jane Jacobs, right? Is the sense that she was very virulently against nostalgia. And we find ourselves in some ways trying to preserve those things that we see as her ideals through a sort of sense of nostalgia for them. So you can go easily back and forth with these arguments over what urban values to take forward into the future with her ideas. And maybe this is one of these great conundrums as to what we might do with a place like the garment district. And it gives us this problem in thinking about how do we use some of her ideals, right, in some of the ways that Nate perhaps was using, to think about what you might do with a problem like the garment district.
And let me
sense that you have something.
Yeah, let me throw a wrench in this, because I was just talking about her whole idea that we should just abolish land use planning, right? That's why the garment district is still there, is because it's protected by zoning. So it's this is one of those situations, but she would also be very against the idea of cataclysmic change, right? This idea that we would just de-zone it and then it would destroy itself, or we would move it wholesale to some other thing. I think she'd be against both of those options potentially, but who knows? It's a really tough problem. That's the second Jane Jacobs century, right?
Just figuring out
all of not just talking about she saved this, she saved that, but also like all of these ideas that haven't been tested or are tested in little places over here and there, but we haven't really learned from yet. I think that's the opportunity.
I think one of the geniuses of her original thoughts and theories on neighborhoods really stem from something which I didn't hear today. And they really stem from the notion of what is the border between neighborhoods, how much is the border permeable, and how does it atrophy, or the opposite of atrophy, the life in that neighborhood. And those borders could, and this is the sum and substance of making a long-term healthy neighborhood, is that it has the ability to absorb new things, to modify itself, and to change into something else.
Right.
Where you have elevated expressways, where you have the 3rd Avenue L, where you have a non-porous, non-permeable border, you then lead to the notion of a lack of circulation.
Right. The border
whatever
vacuum.
that is, and again, atrophy and death.
Absolutely.
The border vacuum, right, is what she called it.
Yeah, she used to think that those sorts of borders, basically all of the uses alongside them were negatively affected by the border, and that seeped further into the neighborhood, and then of course it divides it from anything on the other side.
So I would just encourage, because that was what I took away from the original readings of the books, and it just didn't seem to sort of conflict.
Thank you.
Well, I think we had a nice ending when you said the Jane Jacobs second century, and I think about 10 minutes ago we hit the point where a glass of wine would be a better way to have this discussion. So I think maybe we should go move on to that phase. There is some wine, but we do a author's talk on a topic that is about New York or high-rises or urbanism or international architecture once a month, and I invite you to look at our website and come back for that, and especially to become a member, because when you are a member you get priority seating for our most popular events and free admission, and you get a discount on the book if you're going to buy it tonight. So please do become members of the museum and support our efforts. So tonight we're celebrating in the conversation that was conceived by Sandy and Nate the beginning of the 2nd century of Jane Jacobs. And if you were here last year on May 4th, was anybody here for Jane Jacobs' birthday? Yeah, well, my husband was here, yes, thank you very much. And my staff was here, good, I was here too. We celebrated the centennial of the birth of Jane Jacobs on May 4th in 1916, the same year as zoning was passed. And because I was listening to NPR this morning, 1 year before John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born, which really surprised me. And I began to think about why I was so shocked, because I came to love and admire Jane Jacobs, and like so many friends of my generation who are art historians or urbanists, we say uniformly, Jane Jacobs changed my life. We read the book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, and we said, yes, this is the way that I feel about cities, and in a way found a kind of resonance that was so important to one's own kind of emotional connection, I think, to a city like New York. And so why was it so strange to me that Jane Jacobs and JFK were contemporaries? And so I was thinking about that, and it's because I think that we, I don't know, my generation and maybe all of the generations, treat Jane Jacobs as an evergreen, as a perennial, because there are these truths that seem to transcend time with Jane Jacobs. I just pulled your first paragraph. I just pulled your first paragraph out.
My second sentence.
Yeah, and I didn't read Jane Jacobs until I think probably 1973 or 74. So that was the first time that I read her book. And JFK was already dead by then, right? So you experience death and life in a moment in time which contextualizes it, I think, in your particular moment. But you live with it as a document that doesn't change, even as for these 25 or 30 years I've been assigning it to my classes, year after year, for its perennial truths about the city. And I think what is particularly interesting, because last year on her birthday, Peter Lawrence, who wrote Becoming Jane Jacobs, which is a book that you see right there on the table, talked about his biography of the early Jane Jacobs as she is becoming the person who is the Jane Jacobs that is the perennial urbanist, and so beautifully contextualizing her in New York of that moment of the 1940s and 50s and 60s leading up to the death and life. And that's what Sandy Zipp has done in his great book Manhattan Projects, which looks at New York in the Cold War years, to contextualize these people in their moment in time, not in the timelessness of their ideas. And of course, that's the exercise of a number of younger scholars like Peter and like Sandy and like Nate, who are not discovering, but are like excavating the works and contextualizing them in the the archaeology of the moment in New York. And I think that's the great insight that needs to be brought to Jane at the same time in order to countervail against her timelessness, Jane in her time. So this topic of the second Jane Jacobs century, I think, is particularly interesting to start at this moment, as in the second 100 years, are we finding a usable Jane Jacobs for our moment, or are we situating her in her particular moment? So they're going to talk about that a little bit tonight with this wonderful book that they put together as a series of essays that Jane did across her life, and they have shaped into a kind of a spectrum of her thought and brought back into public attention some of the work that's lesser known. So this is Sandy Zipp, who is a professor at Brown University, and Nate Storring, who is an urbanist, well, as he likes to describe himself, as he says on the website, a writer, a curator, and a designer who specializes in making contemporary urban design, planning, and policy accessible to the general public. So we'll see.